The property tax receipt was due by Friday. That is the only reason I opened the filing cabinet at all. Our accountant, a careful and somewhat nervous man named Philip who had managed our household finances for 9 years, had sent me 3 email reminders about it over the course of 2 weeks, each one slightly more apologetic in tone than the last, as though he was worried that asking me to locate a single document was an imposition I might hold against him. I had forwarded all 3 emails to Gregory without comment. Gregory had not responded to any of them. I had then sent Gregory 2 text messages and left him 1 voicemail, all of which said essentially the same thing: Philip needs the property tax receipt by Friday, can you please pull it from the cabinet in the office? Gregory had read the text messages, I could see the read receipts, and had not replied to either of them. The voicemail went unreturned. It was Thursday evening. Philip needed the document by the following morning. Gregory was at a dinner with clients and would not be home until 10 o'clock at the earliest, which was a pattern so established in our marriage that I had stopped marking it on the calendar. The office was his room in the way that certain rooms in a shared home quietly become one person's territory without any formal declaration ever being made. He had never said to me, "Do not go in there." He had never needed to. The understanding was architectural. His desk, his shelves, his cabinet, his space. I respected it the way you respect the private rhythms of someone you love, which is to say I respected it without examining whether the respect was reciprocal or what it actually meant about the balance of our life together. I went into the office because Philip needed the receipt by Friday and Gregory was not answering, and there was nothing complicated about locating one document in a filing cabinet that contained the organized records of our shared life. The cabinet was a 4-drawer lateral unit pushed against the wall beneath the window that looked out over the back garden. Gregory was meticulous about organization in a way that he was not meticulous about almost anything else. Every drawer was labeled. Every folder inside every drawer was labeled. I opened the second drawer from the top because that was where property-related documents lived according to the label on the front, and I began working through the folders from left to right. The manila envelope was sitting between a folder labeled Homeowner's Insurance and a folder labeled Property Maintenance Records. It was thick, noticeably heavier than either folder beside it, and it was sealed along the top with a strip of packing tape pressed down so firmly that the edges had gone slightly translucent from the pressure. It was labeled with our home address in handwriting I did not recognize, printed in blue ink in a careful, deliberate hand that belonged to someone who wrote for professional purposes, someone accustomed to labeling things accurately. I assumed it was what I was looking for. The address on the front was ours. I picked it up. I turned it over in my hands. I looked at the tape along the top and felt, briefly, that pulling it open would be a small intrusion, a minor crossing of the invisible line between his space and mine. Then I reminded myself that I was looking for a document that had my name on it as much as his, that the house belonged to both of us, that Philip needed the receipt by 8 o'clock Friday morning, and I peeled back the tape and opened the envelope. It was not the property tax receipt. The first page was a cover sheet from a title company I did not recognize, a firm called Meridian Title Associates with an address in a part of the city I did not often visit, a business district that housed the kind of professional services that operated without much public visibility. Below the cover sheet was a document I recognized immediately by its structure and format because I had spent 11 years of my professional life reading documents exactly like it. It was a deed transfer. Specifically, it was a warranty deed transferring title to our primary residence from Gregory Allen Mercer and Diana Catherine Whitfield Mercer, joint tenants, to Rosalind and Mercer, a single woman. My mother-in-law's name. I stood in the middle of my husband's office holding this document and I read it again from the first line to the last. I read the legal description of the property. I read the grantor names. I read the grantee name. I read the notarization block, which had been executed on a Thursday morning 4 months ago by a notary whose stamp I did not recognize. I read the consideration line, which listed $1 and other valuable consideration, which is the language used when the transfer is not an arm's-length sale, when it is a strategic movement of title between parties who share an interest in the outcome. I set that document aside and looked at the next one. It was a second deed transfer. The Lake House. The property we had purchased 7 years ago after a weekend trip when we fell in love with the water and the quiet and told each other we deserved something that was just ours, just a place to breathe. That deed had been retitled in the same way, from our joint names to Rosalind and Mercer, executed 2 months after the primary residence transfer, notarized on a Wednesday afternoon by the same notary whose stamp I had just read on the first document. The third document was not a deed. It was an account transfer form for an investment account held jointly at a brokerage we had used since the 2nd year of our marriage. The account, which I knew carried a balance in the mid-six figures because I had reviewed the quarterly statement in January, had been transferred into a new individual account under Rosalind's name and social security number. The form was dated 6 months ago. The signature on the grantor line was Gregory's. I counted 4 more account transfer forms behind it. 3 investment accounts and 1 brokerage account, all moved in the same pattern, Gregory's signature on the transfer line, a notary seal, Rosalind's name on the receiving end, dates ranging across a period of 6 months that started 8 months before the Thursday evening I was currently standing in my husband's office with a property tax receipt I still had not found. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because I think it matters, because I think people who have not experienced a specific kind of betrayal imagine it comes with immediate heat, with anger that rises fast and loud and fills the room. What I felt was the opposite of heat. It was a cold, clarifying stillness, the kind that comes when something you have been half sensing at the edge of your awareness for a long time finally resolves into a shape you can name. I had not known this was coming. But I had felt, in some unexamined chamber of my understanding, that something in the architecture of my marriage had shifted in the past year. Gregory had been different. Not dramatically. Not in the ways that announce themselves. He had been quieter in a way that I had attributed to professional stress. He had been more careful with his phone in a way that I had attributed to a deal he said was sensitive. He had been less present in a way I had attributed to the ordinary erosion of 14 years together. The envelope in my hands told me what I had actually been sensing. I went through the entire envelope from the first page to the last. There were 18 documents in total. I read every one. When I was finished, I set the stack on the edge of the desk and I stood very still for approximately 3 minutes and I processed what I was holding. Then I did something that I think surprised even me. I did not make a phone call. I did not sit down. I did not cry. I opened the drawer on Gregory's desk where I had once seen him drop his personal cell phone when I knocked on the office door without warning, a small unguarded motion that I had noticed and filed without consciously understanding why I filed it. I opened the drawer. There was a second phone in it, a model I did not recognize, older than the phone Gregory used publicly, the kind of secondary device that exists for a specific and deliberate purpose. The phone was not locked. I have thought about this detail many times since and I believe he left it unlocked because he kept it in a locked room, which is the logic of someone who layers his security rather than doubling it in the same place. He had the locked room. He did not need the locked phone. The calculation made sense if you believed the locked room was enough. He had believed the locked room was enough. I opened the message thread at the top of the screen. It was a long conversation between Gregory and his mother that dated back 11 months. I did not read every message that night. I read enough. I read the message from 9 months ago in which Gregory told Rosalind that he had made a decision and he needed her help moving certain things. I read the message from 8 months ago in which Rosalind replied with the name of an attorney she had spoken to, someone her financial advisor had used in a similar situation. I read the message from 7 months ago in which Gregory confirmed that the attorney had reviewed everything and said it could be done cleanly if it was done over time. I read the message from 5 months ago in which Gregory wrote, "The first 2 are done," and Rosalind replied, "Good, keep moving." I read the message from 3 months ago in which Gregory wrote, "The accounts are complete," and Rosalind replied, "Now we wait." I had been read receipts on 2 unanswered text messages. He had been orchestrating the systematic transfer of everything we owned together. I photographed every screen. I photographed every document in the envelope. I photographed the cover sheet, the deed transfers, the account forms, the notary seals, the dates, the signatures, the consideration lines, all of it captured on my own phone in a series of photographs that were timestamped and stored automatically to a cloud account Gregory did not know I had because I had created it the same year I renewed my professional license on a quiet Tuesday morning while he was at the office. Another small private act of preservation I could not have articulated at the time but which I was now deeply, viscerally grateful for. I replaced every document in the envelope in exactly the order I had found them. I pressed the tape back down along the top as firmly as I could. I replaced the envelope in the filing cabinet between the homeowner's insurance folder and the property maintenance records folder. I closed the drawer. The property tax receipt was in the third drawer from the top, in a folder labeled Annual Tax Documents. It had been there the entire time, exactly where it should have been. I pulled it, took a photograph of it with my phone, emailed the photograph to Philip with a note saying the original would follow by messenger in the morning, and then I went to the kitchen. I took 2 chicken breasts out of the refrigerator. I seasoned them. I put them in the oven. I made a salad. I set the table. When Gregory came home at 10:15 he looked tired in the way that men look tired when the evening has been long and not particularly enjoyable, and I handed him a glass of wine and I asked him how the dinner went. He told me the client was difficult. He told me the food was mediocre. He told me he was glad to be home. I listened to every word. I looked at his face while he spoke and I thought about all the things I now knew that he did not know I knew. And I felt the weight of that information settle into me like ballast, like something that would keep me level while everything around me shifted. I said, "I am glad you are home too." He believed me. He had no reason not to. I want to tell you about who I was before I became Gregory Mercer's wife, because it is the part of this story that changes everything and it is the part he never thought to ask about, not at the beginning and not at any point across the 14 years between our wedding and that Thursday evening in March. My name before I married was Diana Catherine Whitfield and I built a practice from the ground up over a period of 11 years that I am proud of in a way I have never adequately articulated to anyone, including myself. I was a licensed CPA. I was also a certified forensic financial investigator, a credential that requires 3 years of supervised case experience on top of the standard accounting qualifications and that exists specifically to equip professionals to examine financial records for evidence of fraud, concealment, misrepresentation, and the movement of assets designed to deceive. I specialized in marital asset fraud. My clients were mostly attorneys representing individuals in high-conflict divorce proceedings who needed someone with forensic credentials to examine financial records, trace hidden transfers, identify discrepancies between disclosed assets and actual holdings, and produce documentation that could withstand cross-examination in a courtroom. I was good at this work. I was very good at it. I had a caseload that kept me busy 10 months out of 12 and a reputation in the family law community that generated referrals without advertising. I had a firm with my name on the door and 2 associates and a paralegal and a caseload that represented the clearest evidence I had ever encountered that people with money and motivation would go to extraordinary lengths to deprive their spouses of what they were legally owed. I knew every method. I had documented most of them. I had watched attorneys use my findings to unwind transfers that the other side had been certain were untouchable. Gregory knew I had been an accountant before we married. He knew the broad shape of it. What he did not know, what I had stopped discussing in specific detail because his attention glazed over when financial subjects became technical, was the forensic component, the investigative credential, the specific expertise I had spent a decade building. It is not that I hid it. It is that he never asked. He was not interested in my professional history in the granular way that would have required him to ask follow-up questions. He knew the outline. The outline was sufficient for him. I left the practice when we married because he asked me to and because I loved him and because the offer he made, that he earned enough for both of us and wanted me present and not stretched across 2 lives, felt at the time like generosity. I understand now what it actually was. I understand that a man who has certain plans for the future of a marriage has specific reasons for wanting his wife to step away from a career that would make those plans more difficult to execute. I am not saying he planned all of this from the beginning of our relationship. I do not believe that. But I am saying that the comfort he felt in my professional absence was not incidental, and the assumption he made, that stepping away from a practice means forgetting what you learned inside it, is an assumption that cost him everything. I renewed my CPA license 14 months before I found that envelope because I had begun to feel, in a way I could not yet name, that I needed to be ready to be myself again. The forensic certification I had kept current throughout the marriage, quietly, through continuing education credits completed online in the evenings when Gregory traveled, because the credential has a renewal cycle and I had simply never let it lapse. Not out of strategy. Out of identity. There are parts of yourself you do not let go of even when you cannot explain why, and that credential was one of mine. Gregory had not thought to ask. He had been too busy building his plan to think about what I might be carrying quietly on my own. While Gregory slept that night, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea I did not drink and I began to think methodically about what I had found, the same way I used to sit with a new case file and work through the landscape of it before touching anything. The transfers were clean on the surface. That was the first thing to acknowledge honestly. Meridian Title Associates was a real firm. The deed transfers were properly executed and notarized. The account transfers had gone through legitimate channels. Whoever Gregory's attorney was, they had done the technical work competently. On paper this looked like a straightforward series of gifts from a married man to his mother, the kind of transfers that happen routinely in estate planning contexts and that carry no obvious markers of intent. But I was not a lay observer. I was a forensic financial investigator who had spent 11 years looking underneath the surface of transfers exactly like these. I knew what questions to ask. I knew what the look-back period for fraudulent conveyance was in our state, and I knew exactly how close these dates sat to that boundary, and I knew, from years of case experience, that closeness to a legal boundary is itself information. I knew that the simultaneous transfer of all significant marital assets to a single family member, executed across a 6-month period without disclosure to the other spouse, at a time when that spouse had no knowledge that the marriage was in distress, was not estate planning. It was asset stripping. It was the financial preparation for a divorce filing designed to leave me with nothing to claim in equitable distribution. I also knew one other thing that I had not yet fully processed. 2 of those investment accounts, specifically the ones established earliest in our marriage, contained a significant proportion of funds that had originated from my own premarital savings. I had contributed those funds to the joint accounts in the first years of our marriage as a gesture of partnership, a demonstration of shared financial life. I had the original statements. I had kept them in a fireproof box in a closet Gregory never opened, not out of any particular foresight but because the box had come with me from my apartment and I had always meant to sort through its contents and had never gotten around to it. The funds could be traced. The origin could be documented. Those accounts had never been his to transfer regardless of how cleanly the paperwork was executed. I sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning. Then I went to bed. I did not lie awake. I went to sleep with the focused calm of a professional who has accepted the parameters of a case and begun preparing her response, which is what I was, underneath the 14 years of dinners and wine glasses and the ordinary intimacy of a shared life. I was a professional. I had simply been on leave. When Gregory kissed my forehead before he left for the office the following morning, I said have a good day with exactly the warmth I had always used, and I meant none of it, and I felt none of the guilt that I think he would have expected me to feel, because I had done nothing wrong, and the clarity of that was its own kind of armor. I called Philip after Gregory left and told him the original property tax document would arrive by messenger within the hour. Then I sat down with my phone and the photographs I had taken the night before and I began to build the file. Gregory served me with divorce papers on a Tuesday. He did it at breakfast, which I think was a calculated choice, though I have never been entirely certain whether the calculation was his or his attorney's. Breakfast is a bounded moment. There is somewhere to be afterward. The kitchen table at 8 in the morning does not invite the kind of extended confrontation that an evening conversation might produce. He could hand me the envelope, say what he had prepared to say, and leave for the office within 20 minutes. I think he believed that containment was a kindness. I think he told himself he was doing this gently. He came downstairs in his work clothes, which was not unusual, and he poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot I had already made, which was also not unusual, and he sat down across from me at the table where we had eaten approximately 5,000 breakfasts together across 14 years of marriage. He had an envelope in his hand. He set it on the table between us with a deliberateness that was supposed to look casual and did not quite manage it. He said, "Diana, I need to talk to you about something serious." I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. I had known this moment was approaching since the Thursday night 10 days earlier when I had stood in his office and read every document in that manila folder, but knowing a thing is coming and experiencing it arrive are two different events, and I want to be honest about what I felt when he set that envelope on the table. I felt grief. Not surprise, not anger, not the cold clarifying stillness I had felt in the office. I felt the specific grief that lives underneath every other emotion in a moment like this, the grief that belongs to the version of your life you believed you were living and are now being told you were not. 14 years is a long time to build a life with someone. Even when that someone turns out to be precisely who Gregory turned out to be, the years themselves were real. The mornings were real. Some of the love was real, or felt real enough that the distinction stops mattering after a certain point. I picked up the envelope. I opened it. I read the first page of the divorce petition while Gregory watched me from across the table with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this scene and is trying to perform it the way he practiced. He said that he felt we had grown apart. He said that he thought we both knew the marriage had not been working for some time. He said that he had spoken to an attorney and the process could be made simple and he hoped we could approach it as two adults who respected each other. He said the word simple twice in the space of 30 seconds, which told me everything I needed to know about what his attorney had advised him to emphasize. I set the petition down. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "All right." He blinked. He had expected more than that, I could see it. He had prepared for tears or for anger or for the particular wounded silence that requires management. He had not prepared for all right. He said, "I know this is a lot to take in." I said, "I heard you." I picked up my coffee. He sat there for another few seconds and then he said, "The lawyer will be in touch about next steps," and I said, "Fine," and he left for the office. I sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time after he left. I drank my coffee. I read the entire divorce petition from the first page to the last. It was 23 pages. I read it the way I used to read opposing financial disclosures in a case file, methodically, looking for what it said and what it did not say and what the space between those two things revealed. What it said was that Gregory Allen Mercer was petitioning for dissolution of the marriage on the grounds of irreconcilable differences and that the marital estate was to be divided according to equitable distribution principles as determined by the court. What it did not say, what the petition entirely omitted, was any disclosure of the asset transfers that had taken place over the preceding 6 months. The financial disclosure attached to the petition listed Gregory's assets as his professional income, a personal checking account, and a vehicle. The houses were not listed. The investment accounts were not listed. On paper, my husband of 14 years was petitioning to divorce me while holding a net worth that amounted to a salary and a car. I took the petition to an attorney 3 days later. Her name was Sandra Holt and she had been practicing family law for 22 years and she came recommended by 2 separate people whose judgment I trusted. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with a waiting room that was designed to communicate competence without warmth, which I found appropriate given the nature of the work done there. I sat across from her desk with my copy of the petition and I waited while she read it. She looked up at me when she was done and she said, "We need to run asset searches before we do anything else, because this disclosure is incomplete in a way that I want to verify before I make you any promises." I said, "I know it is incomplete." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I know what he transferred and when and to whom." She looked at me differently after that. I gave her the photographs I had taken in the office. I did not tell her yet about my professional background. I wanted to see what she found on her own before I layered in what I already knew, because I wanted an independent read on the situation, a set of eyes that had not been shaped by my own analysis. She looked through the photographs on my phone for a long time without speaking. When she looked up she said, "Diana, these transfers were executed over 6 months. They are clean on the surface. The look-back period for fraudulent conveyance in this state is 4 years, but the burden of proof for intent to defraud a spouse is substantial, and these were done carefully enough that I want to be honest with you about the difficulty." I said, "I understand the difficulty. What I need you to understand is that 2 of those investment accounts contain funds traceable to my premarital assets." She stopped. She asked me to explain what I meant. I explained it. I told her about the original account statements in the fireproof box. I told her about the contribution history I had documented across the first 4 years of our marriage. I watched her expression change as the information landed and settled into the framework she was building. She said, "If you can document the premarital origin of those funds, then the accounts holding them were never part of the marital estate to begin with, and the transfers are categorically different from a legal standpoint." I said, "I can document it." She said, "Then we have a different conversation than the one I thought we were going to have." That meeting lasted 3 hours. When I left, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes, and I thought about Sandra Holt and whether she was the right attorney for what I needed, and I decided she was good, but she was not enough on her own. What I needed was not just a family law attorney. What I needed was a financial litigator who understood asset fraud and could work in concert with a forensic investigator, and the forensic investigator I needed was me. The following week was the week Gregory's attorney sent the first formal letter outlining their proposed settlement terms. I read it at the kitchen table the same way I had read the petition. The proposed settlement offered me the contents of a joint checking account that held approximately $9,000, my personal vehicle, and my personal effects. It offered me no portion of any real property and no portion of any investment account, on the grounds that no real property or investment accounts existed within the marital estate at the time of filing. The letter was written in the careful neutral language of legal correspondence, but underneath the careful neutral language was something I recognized from my years of professional work. It was the language of a side that believes it has already won and is now simply administering the outcome. I set the letter down and I felt something that was not grief this time. It was quieter than anger and steadier than resolve. It was the professional orientation I had spent 11 years developing, the capacity to look at a problem in its full complexity and begin moving through it systematically rather than reacting to its surface. I had been a wife for 14 years. Before that I had been something else, and it turned out that being a wife had not changed what I was underneath it. It had only created the conditions for Gregory to forget. My attorney advised me to vacate the primary residence to protect against an abandonment claim, and she was right from a legal standpoint, and I understood that she was right, and I packed 2 suitcases the following Saturday while Gregory was at the office, and I moved into a rental apartment that I had found online and secured with a credit card in my name only, an account I had held separately throughout the marriage because I had always believed in maintaining some financial independence, a small instinct that Gregory had never questioned and that I had never examined too closely because examining it might have told me something about the marriage I was not ready to know. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building 12 minutes from the house. It was clean and neutral and smelled like fresh paint and the particular emptiness of a space that has not yet had a life lived in it. I put my 2 suitcases in the bedroom and I sat on the floor of the living room because there was no furniture yet, and I looked at the bare walls and I allowed myself, for the first time since that Thursday evening in the office, to feel the full weight of what was happening. 14 years. 2 houses. 3 investment accounts. A brokerage. A marriage I had believed in even when I had felt it shifting underneath me, even when the architecture had changed in ways I could sense but not quite name. 14 years of dinners and weekends and 1,000 small negotiations of shared life. And Gregory had spent 8 months of those 14 years sitting across from me at breakfast and handing me coffee and asking me how I slept and building the machinery that was supposed to leave me with $9,000 and my personal effects. I let myself feel it. All of it. I sat on the floor of the empty apartment and I gave the grief its due because it was real and it deserved acknowledgement, and because I have learned, over the course of a life that has had its difficult passages, that grief not given its time will find its way into other things and make them harder. I sat with it for an hour. Then I got up, unzipped the larger of the two suitcases, took out my laptop and the external drive I had loaded with every document and photograph from the preceding weeks, and I sat down at the kitchen counter and I went back to work. I want to tell you about Rosalind Mercer because I think it is important to understand her clearly, not as a villain in the conventional sense but as a specific kind of person whose specific psychology made this specific betrayal possible. Rosalind was 67 years old and had been a widow for 11 years. Gregory's father, a man named Charles Mercer who I had liked considerably more than I had ever liked his wife, had died of a cardiac event when Gregory was in his early 40s, and the loss had reorganized Rosalind's world around her son in a way that was pervasive and that she had never had any interest in examining. Gregory was her only child. He had been a late and unexpected child, born when Rosalind was 38, and she had treated his existence from the beginning as something she was owed rather than something she was given, which had produced in Gregory a particular kind of confidence in the world's willingness to provide for him that I had once found charming and now understood differently. Rosalind had never said directly to my face that she did not think I was the right match for her son. She had not needed to say it directly. She was a woman who communicated her assessments through a precision of omission, through what she did not ask, what she did not remember, what she greeted with a slight pause before responding. She had never remembered my professional history with any accuracy. She referred to me across 14 years as Gregory's wife who does the numbers, which was both technically true and a specific kind of diminishment that I had decided early in the marriage was not worth contesting. She had never learned the name of my firm. She had referred to my former colleagues on the two occasions I had mentioned them as your office friends. What I understood about Rosalind, and what it took me many years and considerable distance to understand clearly, was that her behavior was not cruelty in the pure sense. It was protectiveness expressed in a way that had never been examined or redirected. She loved her son with the unqualified consuming intensity of a woman who had built her identity around his existence, and anything that competed with that love, any person, any claim, any life he might choose that moved him away from her center, was a threat that required management. I was the most significant threat she had ever encountered because Gregory had actually loved me, at least in the beginning, and that love had genuinely pulled him toward a life that was not organized around her. The transfers were not purely strategic from Rosalind's perspective. I had come to understand this in the weeks since I had read her text messages to Gregory. She was not simply helping her son hide assets from a divorcing wife. She genuinely believed she was reclaiming what had always belonged to the Mercer family. She had helped Gregory financially throughout our marriage in ways I had known about in general terms but not specific ones, gifts and transfers and the occasional quiet payment of a professional expense that Gregory had mentioned and then moved past. She had kept a running internal ledger, I was now certain, of every dollar that had touched Gregory's life that had originated with her. And somewhere in that internal ledger the family home and the lake house and the investment accounts were already hers. The deed transfers felt to her, I believed, less like fraud and more like a correction. She was simply formalizing what she had always considered to be true. This did not make what she had done less actionable. It made it more explicable, and explicable is more useful than inexplicable when you are building a case. Gregory's motivation was simpler and in some ways more painful to examine. He had met someone. I did not know who she was at this point, though I would come to know the basic outline of it later, and the specific details mattered less than the structural fact. He had been involved with another woman for approximately 2 years, which meant that the last 2 years of our marriage, the dinners and the weekends and the thousand small negotiations and the mornings when he kissed my forehead before leaving for the office, had been happening in parallel with a separate life he was already building. The asset transfer plan was not born from that relationship but it was shaped by it. He wanted to move into his next life without financial entanglement. He wanted to arrive somewhere new without the weight of a settlement that reflected 14 years of shared building. The plan that Rosalind had offered and his attorney had blessed was, to Gregory, a form of efficiency. He had told himself it was not cruel because he had decided that the marriage had been over for some time and that what he was doing was simply accelerating the administrative conclusion of something that had already ended in fact. He had worked very hard, I suspected, not to think too carefully about what accelerating the administrative conclusion in this particular way actually meant. I thought about all of this in the empty apartment over a series of evenings while I assembled the complete documentary record of what had been done. I thought about Rosalind's internal ledger and Gregory's efficient self-narrative and the attorney whose name I did not yet know but whose competent technical work I had reviewed in the photographs on my phone. I thought about all of it the way I used to think about a complex case in the years when complex cases were my professional daily life. I mapped the parties. I identified the motivations. I assessed the documentation. I looked for the points of exposure, the places where the careful surface work had not gone quite deep enough, where the intent showed through in a way that could be captured and used. There were several such points. I noted all of them. Sandra Holt and I met again on a Thursday morning, 10 days after our first meeting, in the same office with the waiting room designed to communicate competence without warmth. I had brought the fireproof box. I had brought the original account statements from the first 4 years of the marriage. I had brought a timeline I had constructed myself, a document that mapped every transfer in chronological order alongside the corresponding text messages between Gregory and Rosalind that contextualized each one, demonstrating the coordination between them. I had also brought my professional credentials. I told Sandra Holt what I had done before I became Gregory Mercer's wife. I told her about the firm. I told her about the forensic certification. I told her about the 11 years of casework and the specific expertise I had in marital asset fraud and the look-back analysis and the documentation of premarital fund origins. I watched her sit back in her chair slowly while I spoke, the way a person sits back when they are recalibrating the entire framework of a conversation they thought they understood. She said, "Diana, why didn't you tell me this at our first meeting?" I said, "Because I wanted an independent read before I told you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right. We need a financial litigator. Not instead of me. Alongside me. And I need you to understand that the work you have done on this file is extraordinary, but you cannot be your own expert witness in proceedings involving your own marriage." I said, "I know." I said, "I am not trying to be my own expert witness. I am trying to hand you a complete case that a separate expert can verify and present." She looked at the timeline I had built. She looked at the account statements in the fireproof box. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I think I know who we should call." That evening I drove to the rental apartment through the kind of early spring rain that sits low and steady and turns the streetlights into long reflections on the wet road. I parked and sat in the car for a few minutes listening to the rain on the roof. The empty apartment was waiting for me upstairs. The bare walls and the countertop and the external drive with everything I had built sitting beside my laptop. I thought about Rosalind in the house that bore her name on the deed. I thought about Gregory moving through his parallel life with the efficiency he had decided to give himself. I thought about what I was building and what it was going to cost all of them when it was finished. I was not happy. I want to be clear about that because I think there is sometimes an assumption that the work of protecting yourself is emotionally clean, that the competence required crowds out the grief. It does not. I was not happy. I was precise, and precise was what the situation required, and I had learned long before Gregory came into my life that there are moments when precision is all you have and it has to be enough. I went upstairs. I made tea. I opened my laptop. I looked at the name Sandra Holt had written on a card and given me at the end of our meeting. Then I looked at my phone, and the other number I had been thinking about for 2 weeks, the number I had found in my contacts under a name I had not dialed in 4 years, and I thought about what I knew and what Petra Langford might be carrying that she did not yet know she could tell me. I held the phone for a long time. Then I dialed. Petra Langford answered on the second ring. I had not spoken to her in 4 years, Not since the brief call after her mother's funeral when we had both said we would catch up properly soon and then let the months fold into each other the way old friendships sometimes do when adult life takes over and the distance between people becomes a habit rather than a choice. I had thought about her occasionally in the years between that call and this one, the way you think about people who shaped a significant portion of your early life without quite fitting into the shape your later life became. We had been roommates for 3 years in college. We had studied in the same library chorale on alternate nights and eaten the same bad dining hall food and sat on the floor of our shared room during the kind of late-night conversations that only happen when you are young enough to believe that talking until 2 in the morning is a reasonable use of sleep hours. She had known me before I was anyone's wife. She had known me when I was only myself. She answered and said my name with the particular warmth of someone who is genuinely surprised and genuinely glad. And for a moment I felt the pull of that, the simplicity of two old friends reconnecting, and then I remembered why I was calling and I held the warmth carefully and did not let it move me off course. I said, Petra, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly before I tell you why I am asking. She said, all right. I said, have you done any title work recently on properties associated with the name Mercer or the address on Caldwell Drive? There was a pause. Not a long pause, not the pause of someone deciding whether to lie, but the pause of someone whose breath has just changed because a question has landed somewhere unexpected and tender. That pause told me more than any answer could have. She said, Diana, I need to tell you something first. And then she told me. She had received the referral 8 months ago through a commercial real estate attorney she had worked with on 3 previous transactions. A man named Garrett who sent her periodic work and whom she had no reason to distrust. The referral was for a residential title examination and transfer processing job, 2 properties and associated account documentation, straightforward work of the kind her firm handled regularly. She had taken the job. She had begun the examination. 3 weeks in, pulling the prior deed history on the primary property as part of her standard chain of title review, she had seen the address come up in her records as an address she recognized. She had a box of old holiday cards in the storage room of her office, a habit she had maintained since college of keeping physical correspondence from people she cared about, and she remembered sending a card to that address years ago and receiving one in return with both our names signed at the bottom. She had sat with that recognition for several days without acting on it. The work was facially clean. The client, a man she had communicated with only through his attorney's office and never met directly, had provided all necessary documentation. The transfers were properly structured. She had a professional obligation to complete what she had contracted to complete, and she had no legal basis at that point to decline the work on the grounds that she had once sent a holiday card to one of the grantors. She had continued. But she had not recorded. She had completed the title examination. She had prepared the final documentation packages. She had processed everything to the point of submission to the county recorder's office. And then she had stopped. She had put the file on her desk and she had looked at it for 6 weeks and she had not been able to articulate to herself or to anyone else why she could not make herself submit it, but the file had sat there, unrecorded, final and complete and somehow immovable, while she went about the rest of her work and tried not to think about it too carefully. She said, I have not submitted the recorded copies to the county. The file is sitting on my desk right now. I closed my eyes for a moment. I want to tell you what it felt like to hear that sentence because I think the significance of it is easy to miss if you do not understand the mechanics of what she was describing. A deed transfer does not become a matter of public record until it is submitted to the county recorder and officially recorded. Until that moment, the transfer exists in the paperwork but it does not exist in the legal public record that courts and opposing attorneys rely on when they run standard asset searches. Sandra Holt's asset searches had found the transfers because she had access to instruments I did not discuss in court, but a standard preliminary search would not necessarily have surfaced them yet. More importantly, an unrecorded deed exists in a legal gray space that a motion for emergency relief can reach in ways that a fully recorded and legally settled transfer cannot. Petra had not recorded. The file was on her desk. The window was still open. I told her I needed to meet with her in person. I told her I needed to show her something. She said, I know. Come tomorrow morning. I said, I will be there at 9. She said, Diana, I am sorry. I want you to know that. I said, I know you are. And I did know it. The 6 weeks she had spent not recording that file was its own kind of apology, delivered in the only way available to her at the time. I spent that evening preparing what I would bring to Petra's office. I organized the photographs into a chronological sequence that told the story clearly and without ambiguity, beginning with the cover sheet from Meridian Title Associates and moving through each deed transfer and account form in the order they had been executed. I separated the section that contained the text thread between Gregory and Rosalind, and I printed several of those exchanges in enlarged format because I wanted Petra to be able to read them clearly without squinting at a phone screen. I prepared a one-page summary of the timeline that I had originally created for Sandra Holt, annotated with the specific dates that connected the transfer execution to the communications I had photographed. I organized the original account statements from the fireproof box into a separate packet, clearly labeled, showing the premarital origin of the funds in 2 of the transferred accounts. I packed everything into a clean accordion file and I set it by the door, and I went to bed at 11 and slept without difficulty because I had learned years ago that the work itself, the act of organizing and preparing and moving methodically through a problem, is its own form of rest. Petra's office was on the 2nd floor of a low brick building 4 blocks from the county courthouse, the kind of location that title examiners tend to occupy because proximity to the recorder's office is a professional convenience. The waiting area was small and functional, staffed by a young assistant who offered me coffee and showed me to a conference room with a window that looked out over the street below. Petra came in 2 minutes later and we looked at each other across the conference table for a moment before either of us spoke. She looked the same and different in the way that people look when you have not seen them in 4 years and the 4 years have contained things that showed on their face. Her hair was shorter. There were lines around her eyes that had not been there at her mother's funeral. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something and was tired of carrying it, which was an expression I suspected I was also wearing, though from the other direction. We did not embrace. We sat down. I opened the accordion file. I walked her through everything methodically and without editorial commentary, the same way I used to walk an attorney through a case file in the years when that was my work. I showed her the transfer documents. I showed her the timeline. I showed her the text thread between Gregory and Rosalind, the months of coordination, the confirmations as each transfer was completed, the language of 2 people managing a project together with full knowledge of its purpose. I showed her the account statements demonstrating the premarital fund origins. I set each piece of documentation in front of her in sequence and I let her read without interruption. She read everything. She read slowly and carefully, with the professional attention of someone examining documents for a living, and I watched her expression change as the picture assembled itself fully in front of her. When she reached the text thread, she stopped for a longer time than she had stopped for anything else. She read it twice. She set it down. She put her hands flat on the table and she looked at the window for a moment and then she looked back at me. She said, "He used me to do this to you." I said, "He did not know who you were to me. His attorney referred him to Garrett and Garrett referred him to you, and no one in that chain knew that you and I had once shared a dorm room for 3 years. That is the piece of this that none of them accounted for, because none of them knew to account for it. Gregory does not know we were roommates. I do not believe I ever told him your name. You were part of my life before him and he was never particularly interested in the part of my life before him." Petra looked at the text thread again. She said, "This is premeditated coordination between a husband and his mother to strip marital assets and hide them from a spouse in anticipation of a divorce filing." I said, "Yes." She said, "And the text thread establishes that the intent was to conceal from you specifically." I said, "Yes." She said, "This is not a clean gift transfer between family members." I said, "No, it is not." She said, "And the 2 accounts with the premarital funds were not his to transfer regardless of the deed work because they never entered the marital estate at their origin point." I said, "Correct." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to pull the file." She stood up and left the conference room. I heard her in the next room, the sound of a filing cabinet opening, papers being moved. She came back with a thick folder and she set it on the table and she opened it and I could see the completed documentation package she had prepared, the final recording submissions that had been sitting undelivered for 6 weeks while she sat with a feeling she could not name. She closed the folder. She said, "I am withdrawing from this engagement." I said, "What does that mean procedurally?" She said, "It means I contact the referring attorney and inform him that I cannot complete this matter due to a conflict of interest that I should have identified earlier and did not. It means the documentation I prepared does not get submitted. It means the transfers remain unrecorded." She paused. She said, "It also means that what I have told you in this room this morning is information I am providing to you not in any professional capacity but as someone who had information relevant to harm being done to you, and I am prepared to state that to any authority that needs to hear it." I looked at her across the table. I said, "Petra, you did not have to sit on that file for 6 weeks. You could have submitted it and I would never have known you were involved." She said, "I know." I said, "Why didn't you?" She thought about it for a moment. She said, "Because I have spent 20 years doing title work and I have always known exactly what I was doing and who it served, and for 6 weeks I could not look at that file without knowing that I did not know who it was serving. And when you cannot answer that question about your own work, something is wrong." I left Petra's office 2 hours later with a copy of her signed withdrawal notice to the referring attorney and her direct contact information for Sandra Holt. I sat in my car outside the brick building and I looked at the file on the passenger seat and I felt something shift in the architecture of what had been a very heavy several weeks. Not relief exactly. The situation was still serious and the work ahead was still significant. But the unrecorded file on Petra's desk had been the single most important piece of structural advantage available to me, and it was now in play. I called Sandra Holt from the car. I told her what Petra had told me. There was a silence on Sandra's end that had a different quality than the silences I had heard from her before, a thinking silence, a silence in which I could almost hear the legal framework reorganizing. She said, "The transfers are unrecorded." I said, "As of this morning." She said, "Then I am filing an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order today." I said, "Good." She said, "I am also going to need you to send me Petra Langford's contact information because I want a declaration from her before the end of the week." I said, "I already have it." She said, "Diana, I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "How long have you been building this file?" I said, "Since the night I found the envelope." She said, "And you said nothing to Gregory this entire time?" I said, "Nothing." She was quiet again. Then she said, "All right. Let me get to work." The emergency motion was filed that same afternoon. Sandra moved for a temporary restraining order freezing all assets currently held in the name of Rosalind and Mercer on the grounds that they were marital assets fraudulently transferred to defeat the equitable distribution rights of Diana Catherine Whitfield Mercer, supported by documentary evidence of premeditated financial fraud in the context of an ongoing marriage, including a contemporaneous text record establishing coordinated intent between the transferor and the transferee. The motion was accompanied by Petra's signed withdrawal notice, the timeline I had prepared, the photograph documentation of the transfer records and the text thread, and a declaration from me regarding the premarital origin of funds in 2 of the transferred accounts. The motion was granted 48 hours later by a judge in the Family Court Division who, according to Sandra, read the supporting documentation carefully and issued the order without requesting a hearing, which is unusual and which Sandra said reflected the strength and clarity of the evidentiary package. All assets held in Rosalind and Mercer's name were frozen pending further proceedings. Her checking accounts. Her personal investment accounts. The accounts that had originated with Gregory's transfers. All of them, frozen, with a court order prohibiting any transfer, disbursement, or encumbrance until the family court addressed the underlying motion. I was in my apartment when Sandra called to tell me the order had been granted. I was sitting at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea that had gone cold while I waited. I thanked her. I set the phone down. I picked up the cold tea and I drank it anyway because I had not eaten since morning and I needed something in my hands to hold. Rosalind received notice of the restraining order on a Thursday afternoon. I know this because Sandra's paralegal confirmed service and because Gregory called me for the first time since the morning he had handed me the divorce petition. He called at 4:37 in the afternoon and I let it go to voicemail and I listened to the message later while I sat on the floor of the living room in the rental apartment. He said my name. He said he thought we should talk. He said there seemed to be some misunderstanding about certain financial matters and he wanted to clear it up. He said the word misunderstanding in the tone of a man who has just been told by his attorney that the situation is more complicated than he believed it would be. He did not sound angry. He sounded, for the first time since any of this had begun, genuinely uncertain. I did not call him back. I called Philip instead, my accountant, the careful and somewhat nervous man who had sent me 3 email reminders about the property tax receipt and through whose innocent Friday deadline I had opened a filing cabinet and changed the entire direction of my life. I called him because there was one more thing I needed to do that week and I needed his help doing it. Philip had been my personal accountant since before the marriage. He had a complete record of my financial history going back 16 years, including the premarital period, including the original account statements and contribution histories that predated the joint accounts Gregory and I had opened in the second year of our marriage. He had records I did not have copies of. He was methodical and careful and had never in 9 years made an error that cost me anything. I told him what was happening in broad terms. He was quiet on the phone for a moment and then he said, "Diana, what do you need from me?" I told him. He said he would have everything prepared and ready within 3 business days. He sounded, I thought, slightly relieved, which told me that Philip had been a careful and somewhat nervous man with access to financial records that had perhaps been making him uncomfortable for reasons he had never articulated to anyone. The third action I took that week was the one I had been thinking about since the night I first sat in the kitchen after finding the envelope and mapped the points of legal exposure in what Gregory and Rosalind had done. Gregory's accountant, a man named Warren Aldrich who had handled the tax treatment of the transfers, had signed off on the documentation in a way that characterized the movements as gifts for tax purposes, which is a legitimate characterization in a genuine gift scenario but which becomes professional misconduct of a significant order when the gifts are in fact fraudulent conveyances designed to defeat a spouse's equitable distribution rights and the accountant has access to enough information about the parties to have known or reasonably suspected that characterization. Warren Aldrich had known Gregory for 11 years. He had known enough about Gregory's marriage to have been invited to the dinner party Rosalind hosted the year after the wedding. He was not an innocent processor of information. He was a professional who had made a choice. I submitted a formal complaint to the state CPA licensing board documenting the specific tax treatments Warren Aldrich had applied to each of the 6 transfers, the information he had access to at the time of each filing, and the standard of professional conduct that governs a CPA's obligation when they have reason to believe a transaction they are facilitating may be fraudulent. I prepared the complaint myself. It was 27 pages. It was documented precisely. It cited the relevant sections of the professional conduct standards and the case precedents that defined a licensed CPA's obligations in circumstances analogous to the ones Warren Aldrich had faced. Warren Aldrich received notice of the complaint on a Friday morning. By Monday he had retained separate legal counsel, which Sandra's contact at the board confirmed to her in an informal conversation and which she reported to me with the particular dry satisfaction of an attorney who has watched a well-built case begin to produce the results it was designed to produce. I did not feel triumphant about any of this. I want to be honest about that because I think it would be easy to read the sequence of events and imagine that each step produced a clean satisfaction, a sense of progress and justice accumulating neatly. It was not like that. It was more like the specific tiredness of someone doing work that is necessary and correct and that costs something even when it is right. Every action I took had consequences for people who had made choices. Gregory had made his choices. Rosalind had made her choices. Warren Aldrich had made his. The consequences flowing from those choices were not punishments I was inflicting. They were the natural legal and professional results of decisions that those people had made with full awareness of what they were doing. But knowing that did not make the tiredness disappear. What helped was a phone call I had not anticipated. 2 days after the restraining order was granted, Petra called me back. She said, "I have been thinking about something since you left my office, and I want to tell you." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I have been doing title work in this county for 19 years, and in that time I have processed transfers that I later understood, with the benefit of hindsight, were not what they appeared to be on the surface. I never had grounds to refuse the work, and I never had the documentation to do anything about the suspicion." She paused. She said, "I have your documentation now." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean that the 2 properties that were prepared for transfer through my firm are not the only properties in this county that have gone through a pattern I recognize. I have been looking at my files since Tuesday." She paused again. She said, "When this is over, when your matter is resolved, I would like to talk to you about whether there is a way to use what you know professionally to look at some of those older files." I said, "Petra, let us get through this first." She said, "Yes. But after." I said, "After." I hung up the phone and sat for a moment with that conversation in my hands. The idea that what I was doing now, this painful and necessary dismantling of a life I had believed in, might eventually become the foundation for something else, something that used what I knew in service of people who were in the position I had been in before I happened to open the right filing cabinet on the right Thursday evening. It was not a comfortable thought. It was too large for the apartment and the cold tea and the bare walls and the situation I was still very much in the middle of. But it sat in me somewhere, and it stayed. Gregory's attorney called Sandra that same week and asked for a meeting. Sandra called me to discuss it. She said, "They want a 4-way conference." I said, "When?" She said, "They are proposing next Thursday." I said, "All right." She said, "Diana, I need to tell you something about how I want to approach this meeting. I want to walk in with everything documented, and I want to introduce your professional credentials formally into the record at the table. I think it changes the dynamic of the conversation in a way that benefits you." I said, "I agree." She said, "Gregory does not know what you used to do." I said, "No. He has never known." She said, "He is going to find out on Thursday." I said, "I know." I thought about Gregory sitting across a conference table and hearing my name followed by credentials he had never thought to ask about. I thought about his face in that moment, the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the entire architecture of his plan was built on a foundation he had never examined. I thought about what it would mean to him, not just strategically, but personally, to learn that the woman he had spent 14 years underestimating had spent those same 14 years being precisely what she had always been, and that he had simply never bothered to look. I did not feel satisfaction imagining it. I felt something quieter and harder to name. The truth is that I had loved Gregory. Some version of Gregory, some earlier version that may or may not have been entirely real, I had loved genuinely and without reservation. Sitting in the rental apartment with the bare walls and the external drive and the accordion file full of evidence, I was not the woman who had stood at an altar and meant every word of the vows she made. I was also not entirely separate from her. She was in me somewhere, that earlier woman, and she was watching all of this with an expression I did not have words for. Thursday was 4 days away. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the file. I went back to work. Thursday came in the way that days you have been preparing for always come, not with drama or ceremony but with ordinary morning light and the sound of traffic on the street below and a cup of coffee you make because your hands need something to do while your mind finishes its final preparations. I was up at 5:30. Not because I had set an alarm but because my body had made its own decision about how much sleep was appropriate before a day like this one. I lay in the dark of the rental apartment for a few minutes after I woke, looking at the ceiling, running through the contents of the accordion file the way a musician runs through a composition before a performance, not because they have forgotten any of it but because the act of moving through it in sequence confirms that everything is in place and in order and will be available when needed. I had prepared the complete documentary package with Sandra over 2 sessions earlier in the week. Every piece of evidence was organized in the sequence we had agreed upon, each document tabbed and labeled, each exhibit cross-referenced to the declaration I had signed and to Petra's declaration and to the timeline that mapped the entire 8 months of coordinated activity between Gregory and Rosalind. Philip had delivered the premarital account documentation on Tuesday, a comprehensive package that traced every dollar of origin through a period of 4 years before our marriage, organized with the methodical precision of a man who had been maintaining these records for 16 years and knew exactly where everything was. Philip's documentation was thorough beyond what I had asked for, which told me that Philip had been sitting with information for some time that had made him careful in ways he had not been required to explain to anyone until now. Sandra and I had also prepared something I had not initially planned for but which she had suggested in our second session that week and which I had agreed was correct. We had prepared a brief professional biography, 1 clean page, no elaboration, simply the facts of my career in chronological order. Diana Catherine Whitfield. Licensed CPA, Certified Forensic Financial Investigator. 11 years in private practice at Whitfield & Associates. Specialization in marital asset fraud examination, financial disclosure analysis, and the forensic tracing of concealed or transferred assets in family law proceedings. Voluntarily left practice in 2010. CPA license renewed in 2024. Forensic certification maintained continuously throughout the intervening period through annual continuing education. 1 page. Sandra said she wanted to hand it to Gregory's attorney before she said a word, so that the first thing that happened in that room was the attorney reading it and understanding what he was sitting across from. I thought that was exactly right. I dressed carefully that morning. Not dramatically. I did not want to perform anything. I wore what I would have worn to a professional meeting in the years when professional meetings were my regular life, a dark jacket, simple jewelry, nothing that asked to be noticed, everything that communicated that the person wearing it was not there to be looked at but to work. I had not worn clothes like this in a long time. They fit differently than I remembered, or I wore them differently, which amounts to the same thing. I drove to Sandra's office and we rode together to the meeting, which was held at the offices of Gregory's attorney, a firm called Harwell & Crane on the 19th floor of a building with a lobby that was trying harder than it needed to. The elevator ride up was quiet. Sandra reviewed a few notes on her phone. I looked at the numbers on the panel changing as we rose. I thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill I had developed over years of professional work and which means thinking about everything simultaneously in a way that feels like stillness. The conference room was long and narrow with a view of the city that was meant to impress and probably did impress the people who were meant to be impressed by it. Gregory and his attorney were already seated when we came in. The attorney was a man named Richard Crane, the senior partner whose name was on the door, silver-haired and composed in the manner of someone who has been in rooms like this one many hundreds of times and has learned to read the temperature of a situation before the first word is spoken. He stood when we entered. He shook Sandra's hand. He shook mine. His expression as he shook my hand was professionally neutral, the expression of a man who has made a career of revealing nothing before he chooses to reveal it. Gregory stood too. He was wearing the gray suit he wore when he wanted to look serious without looking aggressive, a calculation I recognized because I had been watching him dress for professional occasions for 14 years. He looked at me when he stood and his expression was more complicated than his attorney's. It had the quality of someone who has prepared for a version of this moment and is now recalibrating in real time because the person in front of him is not presenting as the version he prepared for. I was not visibly distressed. I was not visibly angry. I was the woman who had sat across from him at 5,000 breakfasts and I was also, in a way he could probably sense without yet being able to name, someone he had not met before. We sat. Sandra placed the professional biography face down on the table in front of her. She did not reach for it yet. She opened with a brief summary of the procedural posture of the matter, the outstanding restraining order, the frozen accounts, the status of the title work through Petra's firm, the documented premarital asset origins. She spoke for approximately 8 minutes in the measured, unhurried tone of an attorney who has no reason to rush because the facts are doing the work for her. Richard Crane listened without interrupting. Gregory listened without looking at me. Then Sandra said, "Before we discuss settlement parameters, I want to introduce something that provides context for the position my client is taking in these proceedings." She turned the page over and slid it across the table to Richard Crane. Richard Crane picked it up. He read it. He read it a second time. I watched his face during the second reading, and I watched him make the adjustment that a skilled attorney makes when the information he is receiving requires him to rebuild his understanding of the situation he is in. It was a subtle adjustment. It was visible only if you were watching for it. I was watching for it. He set the page down. He looked at Sandra. He said, "I see." Sandra said, "My client has been a licensed forensic financial investigator specializing in marital asset fraud for 11 years prior to her marriage. She maintained her forensic certification throughout the marriage and renewed her CPA license 14 months ago. The documentary evidence package we have submitted in support of the restraining order was assembled by my client personally using professional forensic methodology and represents a complete evidentiary record of the asset transfer scheme executed over the 8 months preceding the filing of your client's divorce petition." Richard Crane said nothing for a moment. Then he slid the page sideways along the table to Gregory. I watched Gregory read it. I had thought about this moment many times in the weeks leading up to it. I had wondered what I would feel when it arrived. I had imagined versions of it in the rental apartment at night while I could not sleep. I had not been able to accurately predict what I would feel, because the experience of sitting in a room and watching the person who had spent 8 months dismantling your life discover who you actually are is not something you can fully prepare for imaginatively. It has a texture that imagination cannot reproduce. Gregory read the page. He read it slowly, more slowly than his attorney had read it, and I could see him moving through it line by line in a way that had nothing to do with professional speed and everything to do with the specific experience of encountering information that is reorganizing something fundamental. When he finished reading, he looked up. He looked at his attorney first, which told me he needed a moment before he could look at me. His attorney's face gave him nothing, which was correct professional conduct and also visibly unhelpful to Gregory in that moment. Then Gregory looked at me. He said my name. Just my name. Diana. Not as a question and not as a statement, just as a word that he needed to say out loud to confirm I was the person sitting across from him, which I understood because I think he was genuinely uncertain in that moment whether the person he had been married to and the person sitting across from him were the same individual. I said, "Yes." He said, "You never told me." I said, "You never asked." The room was very quiet for a moment. Richard Crane broke it by reaching for his water glass and taking a deliberate sip, a small human gesture that had the effect of reminding everyone in the room that we were here for a professional purpose and that the personal weight of the moment, however significant, needed to be metabolized on someone's own time. He said, "Perhaps we should discuss the specific evidentiary issues my client's team is raising." What followed was 3.5 hours of the most professionally interesting conversation I had participated in since the years when conversations like this were my ordinary working life. I want to describe it accurately because I think the texture of it matters, because it was not a dramatic confrontation in the cinematic sense. It was two legal teams working through the documentation of a complex financial situation while the two people at the center of it sat at the same table and occasionally looked at each other across the space of a marriage that was being taken apart with professional tools. Sandra presented the complete timeline. She walked Richard Crane through every transfer in chronological order, cross-referencing each one to the text thread between Gregory and Rosalind that established coordinated intent. She presented Petra's declaration, which described the referral, the title work, the 6-week hold, and her ultimate withdrawal from the engagement, and which constituted a first-hand professional account of the mechanics by which the transfers had been prepared for recording. She presented Philip's documentation of the premarital asset origins, tracing the specific dollar amounts that had entered the joint investment accounts from my personal savings in the first 4 years of the marriage, demonstrating with original statements and transfer records that the funds in 2 of the transferred accounts had never been marital property in the legal sense because they had never lost their character as my separate premarital assets. Richard Crane asked careful questions throughout. He was a good attorney. He identified the places where the evidence was strongest and he probed the places where he thought there might be ambiguity, and Sandra answered every probe with precision because we had anticipated every question he was likely to ask and we had prepared for each of them. I assisted on 2 technical points where Sandra deferred to my professional expertise on the forensic methodology used to document the transfer timeline, and both times I spoke I was aware of Gregory listening from across the table with the specific attention of someone trying to reconcile what they are hearing with what they believed they knew. After the second technical point, Gregory's attorney asked for a 20-minute break. We agreed. Sandra and I went to the hallway outside the conference room and stood by the window looking at the city below. Sandra said, quietly, so that we were not overheard, "He is going to recommend settlement." I said, "I know." She said, "The premarital asset documentation is the element they did not anticipate and cannot neutralize. Everything else might have been arguable at the margins. That is not arguable." I said, "I know." She said, "We go back in and we let them make the first offer." I said, "All right." We went back in. Richard Crane made an offer. It was not an insulting offer, which told me that the 20 minutes had included a frank conversation between an attorney and his client about the strength of the opposing case. But it was not sufficient and Sandra declined it without elaboration and presented a counter that reflected the full value of what had been taken, including the primary residence, the lake house liquidation allocation, the full restoration of the investment accounts to the marital estate, and a specific additional figure that represented the premarital funds that had been transferred without legal authority. Gregory said, during the counter-presentation, in a voice that was quieter than his ordinary speaking voice, that he did not understand how she had built all of this. He was not speaking to his attorney. He was speaking to me. He said it as though there were only 2 people in the room, which in the way that mattered most there were. I thought carefully about how to answer. I had many answers available to me. I could have been clinical and I could have been cold and I could have been the professional I was in every other sense in that room. Instead I said the thing that was true. I said, "Gregory, I built it the same way I built everything. Carefully, and with attention to what was actually there, not what I was hoping to find." He looked at me for a long time after I said that. I do not know what he heard in it. I know what I meant. The meeting concluded without a final agreement that day. That is normal. Settlement negotiations of this complexity do not resolve in a single conference. What the meeting produced was an understanding on Richard Crane's part that the position his client had filed from was no longer tenable and that the path forward required a significant recalibration. Sandra confirmed this assessment to me in the elevator going down. She said, "Crane will call me by end of week." I said, "What do you think the final shape looks like?" She said, "I think you get the house. I think the lake house proceeds go in your favor. I think the accounts are restored and divided correctly. I think the question is how long it takes him to accept that." It took 2 more weeks of written negotiation, during which Sandra and Richard Crane exchanged a series of letters that moved systematically through each asset and each account and each point of contention. I read every letter. I annotated several of them. Sandra said I was the most useful client she had ever worked with in terms of the preparation and documentation support, and I told her that was because this was not actually a different skill set from the one I had used professionally for 11 years, it was the same skill set applied to my own life, which was strange and clarifying in equal measure. During those 2 weeks the consequences that I had set in motion continued to develop on their own timeline. Warren Aldrich, Gregory's accountant, appeared before the state CPA licensing board for a preliminary inquiry into the complaint I had filed. I was not present. I received a notification from the board confirming that the inquiry was proceeding and that a formal hearing had been scheduled for the following month. Sandra's contact at the board told her informally that the documentation package I had submitted was among the most thorough and technically precise complaints the board had received in recent memory, which she relayed to me with the dry and slightly delighted tone that she used when things were going as they should. Rosalind's situation developed separately and in some ways more significantly. Sandra filed a civil complaint against Rosalind personally in her capacity as the knowing recipient of fraudulently transferred marital assets. The complaint named her as a defendant in her own right, distinct from the divorce proceedings, and sought recovery of the transferred property and accounts plus damages representing the carrying costs and losses I had incurred as a result of the fraudulent transfer. Rosalind retained her own attorney, separate from Richard Crane, which was the correct decision from a legal standpoint because her interests and Gregory's interests were no longer fully aligned once the civil complaint was filed. Her attorney, a woman named Catherine Pruitt whom Sandra knew professionally and described as careful and realistic, reviewed the complaint and the supporting documentation and reportedly advised Rosalind that her exposure was genuine and that the documentation opposing counsel possessed was unlikely to be overcome. Rosalind called Gregory after that meeting. I know this because Gregory's attorney mentioned in a letter to Sandra that his client had become aware that the civil complaint against his mother was creating significant distress within the family and he wanted to discuss whether resolution of the divorce proceedings might also address the civil matter. Sandra wrote back and said that the civil matter and the divorce proceedings were separate and would be addressed separately, which was the correct legal position and which also happened to communicate to everyone involved that the leverage in this situation was not theirs to apply. The specific moment in those 2 weeks that I carry most clearly was not a legal development. It was a phone call I received from Gregory on a Wednesday evening, 9 days after the conference room meeting. He called from his personal number, not through the attorney, which meant either that Richard Crane did not know he was calling or that Richard Crane had decided not to advise against it. I almost did not answer. I sat and looked at his name on the screen through 3 rings. Then I answered. He said, "I need to tell you something and I am not calling as a party to legal proceedings." He sounded tired in a way that was different from the tiredness I had heard in his voicemail after the restraining order. That tiredness had been the tiredness of someone who has discovered that their plan has complications. This was the tiredness of someone who has been sitting alone with something for 9 days and needs to put it down somewhere. He said, "I did not know you kept your license." I said, "I know you did not." He said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It would not have changed what I did." I want to be honest about that. I said, "I know it would not have." He said, "But I should have asked anyway." Not because of the legal situation. Because you were my wife and I stopped being interested in who you were and I should have noticed that and I did not. I did not know what to say to that. It was the most honest thing Gregory had said to me in what I suspected was several years. It did not change what had been done. It did not change the 8 months of coordination and the text thread and the transfer documents and the secondary phone in the locked drawer. But it was honest and it was said without the protective language of legal positioning and I recognized it for what it was, which was a man acknowledging, too late and in incomplete terms, that he had failed at something he had not thought was important until the failure had consequences. I said, "Thank you for telling me that." He said, "I am sorry, Diana." I said, "I know." He said good night. I said good night. We hung up. I sat in the rental apartment for a long time after that call. I looked at the bare walls that were becoming familiar in the way that spaces become familiar when you inhabit them long enough, the particular texture of their neutrality becoming something that belongs to you. I thought about what he had said and what he had not said and the space between those 2 things. I thought about 14 years and about the woman I had been at the beginning of them and the woman I was now and what had been lost in the distance between those 2 people and what had been preserved. What had been preserved was everything that mattered. The work. The knowledge. The professional identity I had put down and quietly maintained and now was picking back up with both hands. The capacity to look at a difficult situation clearly and move through it methodically without losing myself in the emotional current of it. These things had survived the marriage and they had survived the 8 months and they had survived the rental apartment and the bare walls and the cold tea and the nights I had sat on the floor in the dark. They were mine. They had always been mine. Gregory had never had the power to take them because he had never understood they existed. Thursday was 4 days away from when I had first walked into that conference room, and the settlement that would end this chapter of my life was coming. I could feel the shape of it forming in the letters between the attorneys and in the tone of Richard Crane's correspondence and in the quiet that had settled over the legal machinery since the meeting, the quiet of a negotiation that has found its conclusion and is now simply working out the terms. I opened my laptop. I looked at the complete file I had built. I thought about Petra and the unrecorded deeds and the 6 weeks she had spent sitting with a feeling she could not name. I thought about Philip and the meticulous records he had kept for 16 years. I thought about Sandra and the competent precision with which she had taken everything I had assembled and used it in the rooms where it needed to be used. I thought about what I was going to do when this was finished and the life I was going to build on the other side of it. Then I closed the file because the work on this matter was nearly done and I was already thinking about the next thing and what it might become. The settlement papers arrived at Sandra's office on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks after the conference room meeting. She called me when they came in. She read me the key terms over the phone in her measured, unhurried voice. I stood in the kitchen of the rental apartment and I listened to every word. When she finished I said, "Is this everything?" She said, "Diana, this is more than everything. This is what the case was worth." I said, "Send me the papers." I sat down at the kitchen counter with the papers when they arrived and I read them the same way I had read everything from the beginning, carefully, from the first line to the last, looking at what they said and what they did not say and what the space between those two things revealed. When I had finished reading I set them down and I sat very still for a moment. Then I picked up my pen. I signed the settlement papers on a Tuesday morning in Sandra Holt's office on the 14th floor with the waiting room that communicated competence without warmth, and I want to tell you about the specific quality of that moment because I think it is different from what people imagine when they picture the end of something like this. People imagine relief. They imagine the clean exhale of a person who has been holding their breath and can finally stop. They imagine tears or triumph or the particular brightness of someone who has come through something difficult and arrived at the other side intact. I had imagined versions of those things myself in the months between the Thursday evening I had found the envelope and the Tuesday morning I was now sitting in, and none of the versions I had imagined were accurate to what I actually felt when I put the pen to the signature line. What I felt was a deep and specific stillness. The kind that comes not from the absence of feeling but from the presence of so much feeling that it settles beneath language and becomes something quieter and more fundamental than any single emotion. I felt the weight of 14 years and the weight of what had been done within them and the weight of what I had built in response to what had been done, all of it present at once in the moment the pen moved across the paper, and then the pen lifted and Sandra said, "That is everything," and the weight did not disappear but it shifted, redistributed itself across a different architecture. The architecture of what came after rather than what had been. Sandra had reviewed every term with me twice over the preceding week. I knew exactly what I was signing. The primary residence on Caldwell Drive was awarded to me outright, full title in my name alone, with Gregory responsible for all costs associated with vacating the property within 30 days. The lake house was to be listed for sale within 60 days and the proceeds divided at 60% to me and 40% to Gregory. The additional allocation reflecting the documented fraudulent nature of the transfer and the legal costs I had incurred as a direct result of it. The 4 investment accounts and the brokerage account were fully restored to the marital estate and divided according to equitable distribution principles, which after 14 years of marriage and with the documentary record we had assembled produced a division that Sandra described as favorable without elaboration, which was her way of saying it was significantly better than anything Gregory's initial position would have offered. The civil matter against Rosalind was addressed separately and resolved separately, through a negotiated agreement between Rosalind's attorney Catherine Pruitt and Sandra that I will not detail in full because some of the terms were confidential at Rosalind's insistence, which I agreed to because I did not need the world to know every particular of what Rosalind paid and Sandra advised me that confidentiality on that point cost me nothing and bought me the faster resolution of a matter I was ready to have finished. What I will tell you is that the figure was not small and that Rosalind's personal accounts, which had been frozen under the restraining order, remained frozen until the agreement was signed, which gave her attorney a clear and practical reason to move quickly. Warren Aldrich's licensing matter proceeded on its own timeline, independent of the settlement, Because the professional conduct complaint was filed with the state board and the board's process is not subject to the parties' private agreements. The formal hearing took place 6 weeks after I signed the settlement papers. I submitted the documentary record I had prepared and I answered the board's questions in writing through a sworn declaration that Sandra helped me structure for the proceeding. The board issued its determination 8 weeks after the hearing. Warren Aldrich received a formal censure, which means a permanent notation in his professional record, and a 2-year suspension of his CPA license, which means he could not practice for 2 years from the date of the determination. His attorney filed a request for reconsideration. The board denied it. I received notification of the final determination on a Thursday afternoon, which felt appropriate given that the Thursday I had opened the filing cabinet was where all of this had begun. I did not celebrate any of these developments individually. I noted them. I filed the notifications. I moved forward. The day I returned to the house on Caldwell Drive was a Saturday in late autumn, 6 weeks after the settlement was signed. Gregory had vacated on schedule and the property manager Sandra had recommended had handled the logistics of confirming the vacancy and securing the property in the interim, so I had not been back inside since the Saturday I had packed 2 suitcases and driven away with the particular focused calmness of someone who has accepted the parameters of a situation and is moving through it rather than around it. 6 weeks is not a long time in absolute terms, but it had been long enough for the house to acquire the specific quality of a space that has been emptied and is waiting to understand what it is going to become next. I unlocked the front door and I stood in the entry for a moment before I went in. The light through the windows was the particular light of a late autumn morning, low and clear and slightly golden in the way that light gets when the angle of the sun has shifted for the season, and it lay across the floor of the entry in long rectangles that reached toward the kitchen. The house smelled like itself, the particular combination of wood and paint and the faint residual warmth of a structure that has been inhabited for many years, and underneath that smell was something older, the accumulated texture of all the years I had lived inside these walls, both the ones I had believed in and the ones I now understood differently. I walked through every room before I put anything down. Not to inventory, not to check, just to be in the space and let the space be what it was. The kitchen where I had stood so many Thursday evenings making dinner after finding what I had found. The office where the filing cabinet still stood against the wall beneath the window, empty now. Gregory had taken his files, but the cabinet itself remained because it was a fixture. I stood in the doorway of the office for a moment and looked at the cabinet and I felt something that was not anger and not grief and not satisfaction but some combination of all three that does not have a single name. Then I went to the kitchen and I made coffee and I sat at the table where Gregory had handed me divorce papers and I drank my coffee and I looked out the window at the back garden that needed attention after 6 weeks of vacancy and I thought about what I was going to plant in the spring. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed because I think they are important and because I think the version of a story like mine that people usually hear ends at the settlement, ends at the signing, ends at the moment the legal machinery has done its work and the outcome is secured, and what happens after that is treated as implied, as though resolution and recovery are the same event. They are not. They are sequential but they are not simultaneous, and the work of the weeks after the settlement was different from the work of the months before it but it was still work. Still the daily practice of rebuilding something on the foundation of what remained. I redecorated the bedroom first. Not dramatically. I removed what had been Gregory's and I moved what had been mine to the center of the space rather than its edge and I bought a single piece of furniture that was entirely my own choosing, a reading chair in a deep blue fabric that I placed by the window, and the combination of that chair and the light through that window at 7 in the morning became the first thing I looked forward to in the day and the last thing I thought about at night. Small anchors matter. I have learned that people underestimate how much the small anchors matter when the larger structure has been dismantled and you are building a new one. I called Petra 2 weeks after I moved back into the house. We had spoken briefly during the settlement process but always about the matter at hand, always within the context of the legal situation, and this was the first call since that context had resolved. She answered the same way she had answered the call that had changed everything, on the second ring, with her voice carrying the warmth of genuine gladness to hear from me. We talked for an hour. We talked about her office and her caseload and the specific things she had been thinking about since our meeting in her conference room. We talked about the files she had mentioned, the older transfer patterns she had noticed across 19 years of title work in the county. We talked about what could be done with that information and what it would require and whether the infrastructure for doing something with it could be built. By the end of the hour we had the outline of something. Not a formal plan, not yet, but the shape of a collaboration between a forensic financial investigator and a title examiner who between them had access to the documentation and the professional expertise to identify patterns of marital asset fraud that had slipped through without consequence because the individual pieces had never been examined together by someone who knew what to look for. The shape of it was preliminary and would require considerable work to become anything real. But the shape was there and it felt true, the way things feel when they are the right next thing. I reopened my practice the following month. I had been thinking about the timing for some time, balancing the question of readiness against the question of waiting too long, and what settled it was a conversation with Philip, my accountant, during which he mentioned with his customary careful neutrality that he had received 3 calls in the past month from attorneys whose clients were in situations that sounded, as he put it, similar in structure to mine. He was not suggesting anything. He was reporting. But his report was a signal I recognized, a market signal in the specific language of a profession I understood, and I chose to read it as such. Whitfield Forensic Associates opened its doors, technically speaking, on a Wednesday morning in early winter, which meant that I sent a professional announcement to a list of family law attorneys I had known before the marriage and which Sandra helped me update with current contacts, and I set up a consultation schedule, and I sat at the desk in the home office on Caldwell Drive. The same room where the filing cabinet against the wall had started all of this, and I waited for the phone to ring. It rang before noon. The first client was referred by Sandra. The second came through Petra. The third arrived through a family law attorney I had known before my marriage who had never stopped practicing and who told me on the phone when I called to reintroduce myself that he had been wondering for years what had happened to me. I told him a version of the answer that was true and brief. He said, "Well, you are back now," and that was the entirety of the acknowledgement we needed. The work was familiar in the way that things are familiar when you have spent 11 years doing them and the intervening period has not erased the knowledge but only held it in suspension waiting to be used again. I moved through the first cases with the professional competence of someone who has not forgotten what they know, which I had always understood intellectually was true but which I had not felt in the specific embodied way you feel professional competence until I was sitting with a case file again and reaching for the analysis as though I had simply been away for a long weekend rather than 14 years. I thought, in those early weeks of the reopened practice, about the particular question of what the 14 years had actually cost me. It is a question I had been turning over since the night in the rental apartment when I had sat on the floor and given the grief its due, and my understanding of the answer had evolved across the months in between. My initial understanding was that the years had cost me professional time and professional momentum, the cases I had not worked and the expertise I had not built and the reputation I had not extended during the period of my marriage. That understanding is not wrong but it is incomplete. Because the 14 years had also given me something that I could not have acquired any other way. They had given me the specific experiential knowledge of being on the other side of the thing I had spent 11 years documenting professionally. I had read hundreds of case files describing what it felt like to discover that a spouse had been dismantling the financial architecture of a shared life. I had read depositions and declarations and the carefully structured accounts of people who had experienced exactly what I experienced on that Thursday evening in March. I had understood those accounts professionally and with genuine compassion. I understand them now with something that has no professional name and that makes me, I believe, better at the work than I was before, better at sitting across from someone in a consultation and knowing not just what to look for in the documents but what it felt like to find it. The lake house sold 8 weeks after it was listed. The closing happened on a Thursday, which continued the pattern of Thursdays being the day on which significant things occurred in this chapter of my life, and the proceeds were distributed according to the settlement terms within a week of closing. I received my portion via wire transfer on a Friday afternoon and I noted the amount and I confirmed it against the settlement terms and I sent Sandra a brief message saying thank you and she replied with the 3 words that I had come to understand were her version of a full expression of professional satisfaction, which was, "Well done, Diana." Rosalind and I have not spoken since before the divorce petition was filed. I do not expect we will speak again. I do not carry resentment toward her in the active sense, not because what she did was forgivable in any simple understanding of that word, but because resentment is a weight I have no interest in carrying, and because understanding her motivation, the possessive love and the internal ledger and the genuine belief in her own righteousness, gives me enough context to set the resentment down without needing to resolve it into something cleaner. She is a woman who loved her son in a way that made her capable of participating in a significant harm against another person. That is both true and deeply human, and I can hold both of those things without needing to collapse them into one. Gregory signed the final paperwork through his attorney, and we have not spoken since the Wednesday evening phone call in which he told me he should have asked and I told him I knew. That call was the last direct communication between us, and it was, in its quiet and insufficient way, the closest thing to an honest reckoning that Gregory was capable of in this situation, and I have chosen to receive it as that rather than as something lesser. He has moved on to the life he was building during the 8 months he was dismantling mine. I have no information about the specifics of that life, and I have no interest in acquiring any. What he does with the second half of his life is his business. What I do with mine is mine. Petra and I meet for coffee on the first Thursday of every month. We started this practice 3 months after my practice reopened, and we have kept it without interruption since. We bring files sometimes. We compare notes on patterns we have each identified in our respective work. We have referred clients between our practices on 4 occasions. We are building the collaboration we outlined on the phone call that lasted an hour, and it is taking the shape of something real and sustainable. A professional partnership between 2 women who once shared a dorm room and a dining hall and conversations that lasted until 2 in the morning, who then lived separate lives for 20 years, and who found each other again at the specific moment when their respective areas of expertise intersected with a problem that required both of them to solve. I do not know what I would have told my earlier self, the woman who stood at an altar and meant every word, about what the years ahead contained. I am not certain that knowing would have changed anything, because the woman at the altar was operating on the information available to her and making the best decisions she could with that information. What I know now that she did not know then is that the person you are underneath the life you are living does not disappear while you are living it. It waits. It maintains itself in the small private acts you perform without fully understanding why, the license renewals and the fireproof boxes and the cloud accounts and the professional contacts you never quite delete even when the profession feels like another life entirely. The person you were before someone asked you to be smaller is still there. She is carrying herself forward into whatever comes next, and when the next thing requires her, she is ready. The reading chair by the bedroom window is the first thing I see in the morning when I wake up. The light through that window at 7 in the morning, particularly in winter when it comes in at a low clear angle and reaches across the floor to the far wall, is the most beautiful thing I see on most days, and I have a good life with a lot of beautiful things in it. I sit in that chair with coffee on mornings when my first consultation is not until 9, and I read, sometimes case material and sometimes nothing professional at all, and I look at the garden below the window that I have been working on since spring and that is beginning to look the way I want it to look. And I think about the filing cabinet against the wall in the office downstairs and the Thursday evening when everything changed. I am not grateful for what was done to me. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is sometimes a cultural pressure on people who have come through something difficult to frame it as a gift, to say that the betrayal made me who I am today, as though the betrayal deserved credit for the outcome. The betrayal does not deserve credit for the outcome. I deserve credit for the outcome. What I did with what was done to me is mine. The file I built and the call I made to Petra and the accordion folder and the conference room and the pen on the settlement papers and the reopened practice and the reading chair and the garden and the first Thursday of every month with coffee and case files, all of it is mine. I built it. With the expertise I maintained and the instincts I trusted and the professional identity I refused to put down entirely, even when I had put it down in every official sense. That is the thing I most want you to take from this story. Not the legal mechanics, though I hope they were useful to understand. Not the specific sequence of what happened and when, though I hope the sequence was clear. What I most want you to take is this: what you know belongs to you in a way that cannot be transferred. People can take your name off a deed. They can transfer your accounts. They can change the legal record of who owns what. They cannot change what you know. They cannot touch the expertise that lives in you. They cannot strip the credential from your identity the way they can strip your name from a piece of paper. What you know is the one thing that does not fit in a manila envelope in a filing cabinet and cannot be retitled in someone else's name. I sat in a rental apartment with bare walls and cold tea and believed for approximately one evening that I had lost everything. I had not lost anything that mattered. And every morning since I have sat in the reading chair in the bedroom of the house that has my name on the deed and I have known exactly who I am. Now I want to hear from you. If this story found you at a moment when someone has been taking things from you, or has already taken them, or has been telling you that what you know does not count for as much as what you are willing to accept, I want you to tell me in the comments. Tell me what you would have done differently. Tell me where in this story you recognized yourself. Tell me about the filing cabinet you opened or the phone call you made or the thing you held on to quietly when someone was asking you to let it go. I read every comment. Every single one. Because the stories in those comments are as important as the one I just told you, and the people telling them deserve to be heard. If you shared this with someone today, thank you. If this is the first story you have heard on this channel, it will not be the last. Every story here belongs to someone who knew more than anyone expected and who used that knowledge at the moment it was needed most. We are nowhere near finished. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And if you know someone who needs to hear that what they know cannot be taken from them, send this to them today. That is the most important thing you can do with the next 30 seconds. I will see you in the next chapter.